We all have capacity for self-deception. If you want to know why somebody does what they do, they are the last person to ask. I think we're moving more towards authoritarian leadership rather than leadership as an activity, and that can result in bad faith actions. And the last lens is
Stephen D'Souza is a philosopher turned leadership coach who works in the leadership and professional development practice at Korn Ferry. Formerly head of executive development at PMI, he's been a leadership consultant and coach at INSEAD, an associate professor at IE Business School, and an associate fellow of Said Business School at the University of Oxford, and authored Shadows at Work, among 6 books in total on leadership and transformation.
Do you think we're reframing our concept of leadership?
it seems that we've regressed. The last decade was a decade of progress. Let's say a progress in global trade. Now we're seeing more polarity, and that also is impacted on leadership.
Is it, do you think, a search for some kind of simplification that makes us want to go for these much simpler structures?
So to give you a simple example,
Hello, Stephen. Welcome to The Power Between.
thank you, Roddy. Delighted to be here and to be reconnected with you as well as a guest.
It's a huge pleasure to have you with us today. A global educator, executive coach and best-selling author, as well as a TED speaker and a Thinkers 50 nominee. And you've had some big corporate roles too, as global head of leadership development at Philip Morris International, and now senior partner at Korn Ferry's leadership consultancy. We first got to know each other, I think it was over 10 years ago, when the first one of your 3-book series came out, Not Doing, which was then followed by Not Knowing and Not Being. And now you've just published Shadows at Work. So we've got plenty to explore and discuss. But I'd love to know what your general, just kick us off, what your general overview of corporate leadership is like. You know, we keep being told there's a leadership crisis and difficult to lead in such a complex world. But what do you think? How do you think people are doing and corporations are doing at that? And particularly if you have any reflections around how mid-level leaders are doing.
Yeah, thank you, Roddy. It has been a journey since the Knowing trilogy, and to that we're going to be talking about Shadows at Work as well, the new book. My general observation is, we've always had this perception of a crisis at the top of leadership. It has become more marked in post-COVID, I would say, because of the confluence of different challenges that leaders are facing. So we've heard, obviously a couple of years ago, the phrase, the polycrisis, in terms of the confluence of challenges coming together that leaders are facing. But we're also seeing that mirrored in terms of the tenure, for example, of the lack of CEOs wanting necessarily to take a new position. So before we would see almost like this CEOs taking on serial roles, and now we're seeing that tailor off, particularly in executive recruitment, where they can see how challenging that particular role is and the responsibilities, the demands that come, their personal toll of taking on the senior leadership role. So I think it is become a much more challenging role to take, particularly at the top. But not only, we had a conversation prior to this podcast about the challenges particularly facing middle managers who are also bearing on the pressures of coming from the top, but also having to communicate, having to lead, and having to implement those changes in the mass of the organization beneath them. And in my experience, and yours as well, they're often termed with pejorative terms like the frozen middle. They're almost seen as blockers to organizational change. And I think as more management responsibility, or let's say even HR responsibility, gets devolved into middle managers, I think that demand on them and that pressure on them is even greater. So we are at this inflection point, in my view, and that the need to provide capacity building, the need to provide support, and the need to rethink the vital, crucial role that those in the middle play, I think is really fundamentally important.
I mean, do you think we're sort of reframing our concept to leadership? We've been trying for several decades now to get away from that sort of idea of a hero lead full of command and control. And I think your book explores, that the elements around psychological safety and the need for leaders to have a better idea of themselves. But it seems to have been a very slow journey, the whole of history. Maybe it's not a slow journey, but often things haven't changed that much. And politically, obviously, we're seeing a lot of strongman leaders around and about. So we're not clearing the deck of them at the moment.
Yeah, it seems that we've regressed, Roddy. So I think there were two commentators. I think it was Edmund Lau and Matt Klein. They came up with coined a phrase called the dark mode shift, where you can think about this as the dark mode on your mobile phone, for example, where everything goes black. And so they talk about this, the last decade or so was a decade of progress. Let's say a progress on climate, let's say progress in global trade, let's say a progress in working across boundaries. But now we're almost seeing a regression of that. So we're seeing, more polarity, particularly in government, in political positions, less cooperation, far more polarization. That also is impacted on leadership, to your point, Roddy. So we are seeing, the rise of the strongman leadership again, whether we're seeing that in political figures, but also seeing that in the expectations placed on our business and corporate leaders. So as the uncertainty, as the volatility has increased, I think we are looking for that kind of clarity and that real direction, rather than, let's say, the distributed leadership that was gaining popularity with holacracy and other alternative models of leading that we saw in the 2000s and the 2010s. It's an interesting observation. And I do wonder, if this is a reflection in response to the turbulence that we're experiencing more broadly.
I wonder, is it because, we do live in complex times, that technology accelerates the way everything happens, and there's so much access to data and data sort of torrents on top of us. Life complex approach to leadership is more complex too, because it's more nuanced and the lines of responsibility are less clear. Is it, do you think, a search for some kind of simplification that makes us want to go for these much simpler structures, even if we know that at a human level they don't often work that very well?
Yes, I think it does take away the pain and the confusion of sitting with complexity, to have somebody who provides simplicity, even if as you say it's been found wanting, at least that clarity and that positioning is a given. So I think that is what's happening. It's constellating around individuals who seem to provide that clarity, provide that direction, and provide that order in uncertainty. So we've lost. A few years ago when I was studying at the Kennedy School, they talked about the distinction between leadership and authority. So leadership is not the position, but it's an activity that can be exercised at any level of organization, whereas authority is, let's say, positional power that holds the system in place. Now, what I think we're doing is we're moving more towards authoritarian leadership rather than leadership as an activity. And for the very reasons that you've highlighted, it does take away the sense of disorder, chaos, and gives that people the perceived sense of stability. Whether the effects are and the consequences of that are the matter is another debate. But I think that's what we're seeing, Roddy. And the expectations placed equally on those in the middle will be to provide those kind of resources really to those who look up to them as their people who provide guidance and day-to-day management as well as leadership.
So yeah, that obviously impacts people in the middle of organizations who then become, I suppose, much more sort of impacted by, if they have their ability to or their agency reduced or removed, then that very much changes the roles that they can play. But your book, Shadows at Work, which I have a copy of here, so people can spot it on the bookshelves, that highlights how leaders can overuse those kind of strengths, and that if they're given authority, then those derailers become much more impactful. Where did your sort of observation around these various elements in Shadows at Work come from?
Yeah, so firstly, just to give the listeners some background, what does shadows mean? And what do we mean when we're describing them in the context of work and the context of leadership? So many people maybe familiar with the idea of the leader's shadow, meaning the influence they cast upon the organization or those beneath them by the very fact that they're in a role of authority. What I tried to do was to look at the shadow in a broader context. And one of the main meanings of the word the shadow comes from the world of psychology, and it was a term that was coined by the psychologist Carl Jung, and it describes almost like an archetype. It describes the qualities or the behavior or the emotions that we once experienced, but that we repressed or suppressed because they were not safe to feel or to express. So, to give you an example, it may be that when you're a child, you're taught don't be selfish, and then you learn to overshare, you learn to give, for example. Now that doesn't go away. But even though that happened at a very young age, you took in or internalized, introjected that message, don't be selfish. As an adult, as a leader, maybe as a middle manager, you find yourself giving of yourself too much. You find it really hard to say no and to establish boundaries. You might neglect your own self-care. But the point that Jung was making about the shadow is that it's not past, but that it continues to influence the leadership and your present in the present moment. So William Faulkner, the American essayist, he used to say, the past is never dead. It's not even past. And in some way, that shadow still lives on. Now, there's lots of literature around the shadow and how it impacts on the present. And because if we're not aware of it, it can unconsciously impact on how we relate to colleagues, to stakeholders, how we behave. Now, that was the predominant lens. What I tried to do, Roddy, in this book was to go beyond just the psychological lens, but to look at the shadow through multiple lenses, and specifically how they impact on the world of work rather than just on self-development. So for the psychological lens, we looked at things like how does that work in terms of projection? How does it work in terms of defenses, derailers, to your point around power, money, sex, other aspects of leadership, embodiment, and also this idea of the shadow life and career? That was the psychological lens. The second lens I looked at was the physiological or biological lens. And this is the idea that we're not just psychological beings, that we're very much embodied, we're physical, we're biological. And how does our biology impact on our behavior as leaders, whether we're in the top, the middle, or the bottom of an organization leading with a customer? Here I draw on the work of, let's say, the evolution biologist Robert Sapolsky, who his own work in, let's say, books like Determined or Behave has shown that under stress, elevated hormones, our amygdala, affect our behavior, that it's not simply our psychology, but it's a complex interplay between our DNA, our genetics, our cultural background, and our own personal histories that can determine how we act. Such a simple act as being tired can result in shadow behavior, unwise choices and decisions that can impact on those that we are leading or managing at any level of organization. The third lens was looking at the cultural lens or social lens, that we all operate within relational systems at work, that we're not this isolated individual. So where we have a personal shadow, let's say it's called the me that I don't see, we have a collective shadow, which is the we that we don't see. So this could be what David Foster Wallace in his Kenyan commencement speech entitled, "This is Water." We're so inside it and immersed, we don't necessarily see what is that cultural shadow. And yet it can influence us. It can result in scapegoating, for example, against other communities. It can result in norms and practices, whether they're driven by incentives, whether they're driven by internal competition, that can result in bad faith actions. And the last lens is the idea of the spiritual lens, which is about meaning and purpose. Often we go through our work with a sense of choice, particularly in the early stages of our career, where we might favor, let's say, security or prestige. And that comes a point in that, mostly in midlife, when we start to reevaluate and question what is our own definition of success, and to rethink, some of the things that maybe we sacrificed. So we might have a sense of restlessness or regret. And the question then becomes, how do we recover or reclaim that sense of purpose or meaning, energy, vitality that maybe we chose not to foster or not to grow in earlier on in our career? So these are essentially the four lenses: the psychology, the biology, the social cultural, and the spiritual lens that I look at the idea of shadow, and in particular, how does it function in the world of work?
You say in the book is that it's not about eliminating the shadows, but it's about being conscious of them and understanding how to cope in a world with them. Because in fact, there's power and strength in the shadows too, isn't there?
No, you're absolutely right. Jung, when he was describing the shadow, didn't necessarily say they were negative. The shadow just means hidden. And so there's also some concept he came up with called the golden shadow, which is the qualities and talents that we're not aware of that we may have suppressed. So, for example, we may have been told by our teachers, I was certainly told, and when I came to study, was art is not a real subject. You should be studying sciences or maths, and there was a part of me that loved art, loved to draw, loved to paint, and yet that was suppressed and not actually given energy. Or it may be, you were told as a child, don't be such a show-off, be quiet, and you learn to suppress your natural vivacity or your capacity to, let's say, speak or entertain or be more exuberant rather than be constrained. So there's a sense that our gifts are also in our shadow, or often the expression is they're in our wounds, parts of us that we perhaps were hurt or we encountered some challenge or adversity, rather than seeing that as a negative only. That could be a particular place that we could teach from, not teaching from our wounds, but teaching from our scars and our learning and how we overcame them, what it taught us to become more human. So that's exactly that. The shadows aren't necessarily things that we remove, but they're parts of us that we reclaim and that we learn. We learn how can they be useful, how can they serve us. An interesting metaphor is simply of a house. Imagine you have a house with many rooms, but you only go into 2 rooms in a house because you're familiar with them. But the other rooms contain capacities, gifts, qualities, and that when you discover them and open them and at least have them available, you can live a richer life, more full of energy, more full of vitality. The challenge is when you're not aware of them, it's not as if they go away. They still influence us. So the famous quote by Jung is, until you make the unconscious conscious, you'll call it fate, and it will direct your life. So they still have an influence on us, whether we tend to acknowledge them or not. So the idea here is for leaders to start to engage with their shadow, to start to confront their shadow and to work with it in a way that enriches their lives rather than derails their careers or their working lives, as we started off this conversation.
So, I mean, a lot of this is, I suppose, what we'd come to term wisdom or self-knowledge and wisdom, and you accumulate that, or you can't have that instantly. It's something you sort of get greater insight into and awareness of as you get older. And so I think it's interesting that, and you also you mentioned that the bit about the spirituality is often something that people only really become aware of or influenced by from midlife onwards. There are outliers. There are people, obviously, it affects at different times, but as a generality, that tends to be the case. So I mean, this idea of having wisdom at work, in terms of how you manage organizations, manage people, I think it is something we don't normally discuss very much. It's sort of off the radar. It's not, and I wonder why that is, because, and I have a particular penchant for always looking at sort of indigenous groups as how human beings are meant to be, because before sort of modern structures are put upon them. And we see a role for elders in there and people who have a capacity to observe and understand and improve the running of the organization. Do you see a role for people like that within the organization?
Yes, like when I wrote the last book, Not Being, this was a book that was really about that topic of wisdom and identity and how do we live the second half of our life. And I wrote about that transition, Roddy, in one of the people that wrote the forward for the book was a gentleman, a colleague called Chip Conley. And
All right. Yeah.
Chip was a very successful hotelier. You know, he had a chain of luxury boutique hotels. And then he went through a transition where when he sold the business, he almost felt bereft. What's my meaning? What's my purpose? And he managed to get a job in a technology company. It was called Airbnb. And he found he was like double, maybe triple the age of the average employee. So, you know, he took on a new role. And the role that he took on, and this was given to him by Brian Chesky, the CEO of Airbnb, he said, you're the modern elder of the organization. You are as curious as you are wise. And so in a way that it's not necessarily about age, it is about experience and it is about reflection. It's that capacity to take on that role where we help with our experience to look at things from a broader perspective rather than being stuck in the narrow perspective that if we have an experience, but we stay curious and we stay wise and that we help guide and we help shepherd. And that's, I think it is a vital role. I think that bridge between, you know, the naivety and the innocence of, let's say, the beginner's mind of youth is equally as critical. And it's sort of a dialogue. So when I do not knowing, for example, workshops with executives, I ask them to write down what they know about a complex challenge and put it on a piece of paper, on another piece of paper to write down what they don't know, you know, all their questions and curiosities. And I ask them to hold both, one in the right hand, one in the left hand. Which is the longer, which was the shorter, which was the easier, which was the harder, which feels the heavier metaphorically, which feels the lighter. And now I don't say to them, take what you know and throw it away. We're not the tabula rasa. We hold our wisdom, we hold our experience, but we also make space for what we don't know. This is the innocence, the naivety, the curiosity, the beginner's mind of youth. And we hold them both. And I think what we tend to forget in leadership management, we tend to overemphasize on or index on one or the other. So either all of that we know, you know, I've seen this before, this is familiar, this is what we should do, or we tend to say, I don't know anything, you know, I'm a beginner here. And wisdom, I think, is this ability to have this opposable mind, to hold both.
To understand balance between.
Yes, and to be able to hold that that naivety or that innocence as well as our knowledge. And I think that's the value that we can bring, that we have the wisdom, but that we also can bring our curiosity and keep that alive. And often that's the part that could easily go missing, particularly when we have experience and there's a tendency to rest on what we know rather than to keep alive the flame of curiosity.
And there's also a tendency, isn't there, for if you have experience and you have knowledge, to push that out upon people
yes.
who report to you. So you then begin to acquire this persona of all knowing because you're always instructing or advising on what you do know, and perhaps not also showing the ability that you don't know stuff. And that then feeds back into this sort of concept that to not know is to be weak. Whereas I think what you're saying is it's an important part of a role that leaders need to play.
Yes.
Yeah, looking at the shadows at work as a structure within organization, are there things that people should be doing within the organization to create those conditions to allow us to be able to, I don't know, what are we supposed to be observing, what these, you know, through those four prisms and seeing how they affect us? Are other simple steps that can be taken to get that to work in an organization?
Personal steps, and there are also systemical steps as well, Roddy. So on the personal side, I think there's a duty for all leaders to be able to do their own shadow work, meaning to be able to be aware and to work with their own shadow. So to give you a simple example, one of the ways that the shadow manifests is through the projection. It's when we don't want to confront something within ourselves, we normally project it onto somebody else. So let's say we don't want to confront our own arrogance or our own grandiosity. We might say, oh, that person is very grandiose. And we'll project it onto others. So the research done by John Piero, particularly INSEAD and Mark Stein, was on this idea of the unwanted self, and that leaders project their unwanted selves onto others. And so when we can able to recognize when this is happening is often when we have an overreaction to somebody or something that's disproportionate to the situation. So, for example, somebody could say something and yet we feel really triggered. And it doesn't seem to be only about that. Something else, we have a clue, something else is going on. So it can be an opportunity to reflect internally. What is it about myself that maybe I'm not seeing? Why am I responding in this way? So there's many ways to work with projection and reclaim these kind of projections. Equally, as a leader, I might be the subject of projection. So we call that projective identification, where some people are projecting onto me the idea that I'm the father figure or that I can rescue the organization. So part of the responsibility there is not introjecting those projections and taking them on, but recognizing what is being put onto us and being able to gently give their work back or to challenge those projections in a way that does empower others, but doesn't leave them feeling bereft or without any self-control. So this is really one of the arts of leadership, just in the area of projection. You talked about defenses and derailers, looking at, for example, our own derailers, which are often strengths that are overplayed as we began that conversation. For example, I can be a very decisive leader, but under stress, my decisiveness can become impulsiveness. Another issue might be, how do I look at my relationship to power? Then there's an interesting thing here called the power paradox. Those who are most suited to power don't seek it, and often those who are least suited seek power and they obtain it, but they quickly derail. So how do I recognize my own power in an organization? The fact that I'm a leader with a title gives me power, but if I try to, let's say, disclaim that or not acknowledge that, it can lead to many issues. And it can also lead to entitlement. It can lead to behavior is negative to the organization and those I lead. So I look at each of those topics and how does that play out in an everyday leader or manager's life, and what are the steps they can do to account for that and to make sure that it doesn't derail but empowers them and leaves them feeling more whole. But the first step to that is definitely the step that you talked about, which is that ability to reflect, the ability to explore our own experiences as a leader, and then to choose differently. And I think that power of pausing, that space to question and to think about what is the impact. I think that's the vital skill of leaders in doing shadow work that I would encourage listeners to explore.
But that is actually something quite difficult to do on your own if you're not given a structure. So, I mean, we run a community for people in the middle organizations, mid-level leaders, which sort of enables and brings together peer discussion. Is that a good way, for people to get into doing this? And we're not talking that this needs to be, a deep sort of therapy or psychologist type investigation, but just surfacing some of these ideas and thinking.
Yes.
What are good ways for people to do that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We all have a capacity for self-deception. One of my tutors at the Kennedy School, he would say, if you want to know why somebody does what they do, they are the last person to ask. And it's almost like we're unconscious as to why we do what we do. So I think every leader or every man needs people that speak truth to them, or the phrase "speak truth to power." They're able to have somebody that isn't invested in pleasing them, or doesn't have any reticence to tell them what they perceive is going on. In the past, that used to be the court jester who played that role, but often they would fall a horrible death. So it was a very precarious role. But now it's interesting to see political, our comedians, our show are being cancelled or they're being taken off the air, because it's a dangerous activity to speak truth to power. So what I recommend is that yes, you could have a group of close friends or community, as you say, but be careful that the community doesn't become a confluent community that is just there to support without the challenge. So you definitely need people that maybe irk you and maybe challenge you rather
You need
than
the court jesters in there.
you need the way I've had it phrased, you need the sandpaper as well as the blanket. So, who are the people that are the sandpaper to you? Because often, we tend to gravitate towards those who affirm us, who share our same political views or same philosophy or leadership views. So it's important that we don't become, in our own filter bubbles, and that we're speaking to those who are offering us a difference of opinion. When I used to work in my first career was in hospitality within HR, and the founder of the company every Saturday he would call one woman who wasn't very senior, but he would ask her, Beverly, what's going on? What's the word on the ground? What are employees really thinking? And that was super valuable. So he wasn't just hearing what others were telling him or but he was speaking to somebody that was knowing what the chambermaids were thinking or what somebody else was struggling in with another area, and was able to tell him the truth. And he really valued that. So we all need to cultivate somebody like a Beverly for us, who is that person that will tell us what we need to hear. And often, Roddy, they're the people closest to us who see our own shadows rather than the people who only see our public personas. And that can tell us, exactly what we need to hear, even though it's uncomfortable. And so we often get the best personal development from those close, if we're willing to hear and we're willing to do our work.
We had Terry Leahy speak at an event that I ran a good long time ago. And so he was chief executive of Tesco's, the big UK supermarket. And he said every Friday he'd always go and visit a supermarket. And he made sure he walked the aisles and spoke to the people stacking the shelves and the people bringing the stuff in from the warehouse at the back of the supermarket, because it was them who, because they were so far distant from him, he got far more truth from them and got a far better observation of what was really happening on the ground level, because it tends to be just the good news that travels upwards and when you're sitting at the top of an organization, you get told everything's working beautifully. That was a really important way of getting information.
I remember there was that series, wasn't there, Back to the Floor,
that's
where,
right.
Senior leaders, we actually had that in the company I worked with. But soon after, that person left the organization because there's a point that yes, it's useful because we tend to only get information from those around us and not close enough to the customer. You use the phrase the psychological safety. Often, even if somebody is on the floor, we can still respond and react to them, knowing that their real power, and it may not give the safety to hear what actually is happening. So I think having that cultural change where it is easier to speak up, it is easier to say things, is critical. So there's a new book, I think it's called The Dark Pattern, looking at corporate failures and scandals, and the own work by Megan Ritz at Ashridge and John Higgins around Speak Up. That Speak Up culture, I would say, Roddy, is probably the most critical component in order to do shadow work within organizations. And it isn't psychological safety as in, we need a safe space here. We can't have anything that triggers us, because I think that's probably a misunderstanding of psychological safety. It wasn't meant to be creating necessarily that kind of environment, but it's an environment of more brave spaces where people can share, that are able to say things that are triggering and confronting, because that's how we learn, not by removing triggers, but by enabling them and being able to work with them. And I think that's a fundamental difference in the kind of safety that we need in organizations, rather than removing triggers and removing the uncomfortable.
Which ultimately is impossible to do, really, in a vibrant organization. There's always going to be something occurring that triggers. You work very internationally. You've been in the Gulf region for a few years now. I mean, do you see the drivers in organizations being significantly different to enabling these kinds of conditions to be created in organizations from there to in the UK or in North America, for example?
I think in the Gulf, it's pretty much where I am in the startup mode. So it's more, building organizations rather than having long established organizations, and for the good and for the ill. So the good is that, new cultures and systems can be set up which don't have to be based on old hierarchical systems, etc. But for sure, Roddy, culture still influences, beyond the company culture, the societal culture, and that can seep into how, authority works or how power works, etc. So for me, it's looking not just at the regional examples, but what are good practices across the globe that we can learn from. And I really like your reference to indigenous cultures and to rethinking, how we can model leadership differently. Because I think we have reached a stage where I talked about that dark mode shift. I've talked about that. We've had the early conversation about regression. What is it that we need to be rethinking about leadership now to move forward? But is it moving forward in as we were, let's say, pre this dark mode or leading from the dark? So what I'm interested in now is, given the situation we're in, what does it mean to lead from this place rather than lead without having experienced this period? In the Not Knowing book, I talk about the dark as a metaphor, and often we think of it as some place to avoid, and yet it's often the place of transformation. Think about the seed in the earth, the baby in the womb. This idea of beyond the analyst, he said darkness illuminates. So in this period, what is being illuminated? What are we seeing come through more clearly? And how do we pay attention to those messages to help us as leaders move forward? So that's the inquiry I think I'm exploring further. And the shadow book is one way to do that. It's a way to explore our own darkness. And that psychological maturity comes firstly from confronting our own capacity for darkness and being able to work with both our shadow and our light. In fact, I start the book with a quote by the English composer Michael Tippett, who died at 93 years old in 1989, and he was imprisoned in Wormwood Scrubs in London. He was a conscious objector to the war, and he wrote a libretto called A Child of Our Time in the start of the World War II, in the aftermath of Kristallnacht, which was a night of great destruction and violence. And he said for organizations, for society to become better, what's needed is not just political activism, but is a sense of psychological maturity. And in the libretto, he wrote a line, he says, I know my shadow and my light, so shall I at last be whole. And I think that sentence, I should know my shadow and my light, so shall I at last be whole, is the key for good leadership and the key for effective organizations.
Are there organizations that you've seen that are good at enabling the conditions for that? And is there some sort of relatively straightforward route towards that, or is it just a sort of lucky collection of ingredients that come together at certain times in certain organizations to allow it?
I do think there is a way that organizations can do this work, and I'm not aware, Roddy, of organizations that do. I'm aware of case studies, for example, at Novartis when they went through a significant, public fines, and then they wanted to change their ethics. They realized that they started to help their leaders engage in this kind of work, in shadow work. There's case studies on that. I think it's by the professors at the University of Lausanne, Palazzo, who wrote The Dark Patterns. In my view, this is still a gap in organizations that often scandals happen, leadership changes, yet behavior continues or the culture hasn't really significantly changed. Part of our work, and I think part of the work here, is to help organizations do the deeper work, the inner work, rather than just to let's have the PR, let's have the statements, but are we really changing the culture? So give you a specific example, the Boeing 737 Air Max disaster, 346 people lost their lives. And, there was change at the top. There was billions of dollars lost from the company's value. And the efforts on, let's say they focused on speed and cost rather than safety and quality. So you'd think after such a big change, loss of lives, loss of company, billions of profit, that things would change. Yet last year, one of their doors flew off a plane going to Alaska, and you'd think there were whistleblowers saying again the issue was around speed and price rather than quality.
And that's the objective, really, isn't it? I mean, that's what we're trying to do. And it happens, you're trying to the ship or the aircraft while it's in motion, and that's always tricky. That is the goal and the role in the sector that we inhabit need to be striving for. A lot of it, I think, is about creating the space to do this thinking.
And I think this is where we come back to, the audience you're speaking to. If I think about my school days, it's not the headmaster that had the biggest impact on me. It's my teachers. It's not the CEO in an organization that has the biggest impact. It's the managers who are the middle managers who are leading day to day. So if our managers in the middle can do their own shadow work, can help navigate and understand some of the topics that we've talked about today, defenses, derailers, projection, I think we'll come a long way in terms of creating better organizations. So I think that this is a critical topic for those in between, really, who hold that vital space of contact within the organization.
And there's a very simple way for them to do that. They buy your book, Stephen. So Shadows at Work. We've run out of time, I think, but that was superb. It was fascinating. It always is speaking with you. I really enjoyed it, and I'm sure everyone listening will have done so too. Stephen D'Souza, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Roddy.